manat mai pe mai na be management. Then what do I say about it? It all comes to human factors. Toto pure. Kalau kita itu pure di mana kita toto kalas. Tapi lain-lain orang pure mana itu toto management. Kayak tu pas mai kata hok pas the presentation from the hok. Ay fakam mai ina su. Reverend Mayan Surprise. Ita ano ay adapting to change the COVID-19. Model pas mai. Fakam kata ni Australia. Pasal kalau Christina dan Ham, kalau tu kalau betul itu orang lain nak baca apa itu dia betul itu. Wow.
Kalau hufanga benye na fatau ko fahoko kama take tau ko kama ya ako ni ka atake o Pag-inuan niya ito ay tangatali ang mundo po ako. Kaya ahon daw whanau mo kami nga mga iheke kami he pureanga mga sekto at taha. Ka ihe presentation ko hindi ka tao kiyafi ay himalay o lotu. Heko university ni Okalaisi. At this opportunity, I'm privileged to introduce to you Reverend Mayan Subrayan, who is the pastor of Refresh Church, and his affiliation with Christ University in the Pacific is that he is a Master of Philosophy candidate at CUP. And he has completed his thesis and is undergoing review by the Dean of the Research Institute, Emeritus Professor Anamawi Taufe-Ulunaki. Reverend Subrayan is speaking to us from Australia, and the title of his paper and presentation is Adapting to Change COVID-19. Please help me welcome Reverend Subrayan.
Hi. Jay, how are you all doing there?
Good, thank you.
Excellent. Am I coming through loud and clear?
Yes, you are.
Fantastic. Well, it's a great honor and a privilege to be able to speak to you today. And the topic that I'm speaking on is on change. And I think with everything that's happened in the world, I don't need to highlight how much of change has taken place in the world. Now, with the talk that I'm doing today, what fits in to my topic is pretty much this jacket that I'm wearing, and that's why I'm wearing this jacket. I don't know if you can see that, but rugby lovers would recognize that logo. That's the South African rugby team logo, the Springboks. Anybody heard of the Springboks there? Show of hands. Yeah, the South African rugby team. And I want to use that as an example to introduce the topic of change. And in the climate that we're in the world that we're living in. I grew up in South Africa and immigrated to New Zealand, where I lived for 14 years. But what I learned in Africa, surrounded by all the lovely big five that we get, the lions, the giraffes, and the buffalo, and all of those animals, is that when an animal lives in an environment, and if that environment changes, and if that animal does not adapt to the changes in that environment, guess what happens to the animal? It dies. So the lesson in that, for us, that if the environment that we are in changes, if we don't learn to adapt to those changes, similar to an animal in an environment that changes, that does not learn to adapt, it becomes extinct. So for us, especially in the time that we find ourselves in, whether you're in business or whatever, it's about being able to embrace the change as vast and as different as it may seem, change should not be seen as something that is negative. It may bring about negative results, but we've got to look within it to find out what is it that we can embrace, because there's a lovely saying which is called the insanity principle. And the insanity principle says, you do the same thing over and over, but you expect a different outcome. And that's why it's insane. Because if you always do what you've always done, then you'll always get what you've always got. So the moral is, be alert and be prepared to step out of your comfort zone. Because as human beings, we love comfort. Now, I grew up in Africa, in Durban, where in winter, I think it's similar to Tonga, where the winter is like, the coldest will probably be 20 degrees Celsius. And then in the year 2000, I moved to Auckland, New Zealand. And for the first time, I experienced cold weather as I did there. But again, how do you see it? How do you perceive it? That becomes fundamental. Because if you see things as a problem, and that's what it's going to remain as. It's going to remain as a problem. So the problem is not the problem. The problem is the way that you see the problem. That becomes the problem. Now, the reason why I'm wearing the Springbok jacket here is because I'm going to share with you something personal about how I had to change my mentality and my thinking. Because the challenge is that I grew up in South Africa at a time when the law of the land was governed by an evil system called apartheid. Now, if you know apartheid, that's pretty much the reason why people like Nelson Mandela was in prison. Because it was a racist, unjust, oppressive system that said if you were not European, you were not treated as a first-class citizen. Now that's the environment in which I grew up under, where it was the law of the land that made me feel inferior. That not just made me feel, but it said that you were inferior. Now the challenge is that rugby, which is very closely aligned to South African culture, was a sport that we couldn't play because we were not the right color. So rugby was reserved exclusively where I grew up in Durban for Europeans, for them. And I associated rugby with apartheid. That as much as rugby was embraced in the rest of the world, but for me personally, rugby was a sport of the oppressor. Now, the irony in the whole thing is that in the year 2000, I was in business. And I was a financial advisor, insurance broker, an accountant, and things were going well for me in the business. And then I got held up at gunpoint in South Africa. But don't worry, I survived, in case you worried. And through that experience, I had to learn something important. That adversity, challenges come into your life not to destroy you, but to build you up. You see, I grew up also that time, he lost how pretty much that if you do bad,